after this first session of the 2-day-long international webinar on cartographies of unbelongingness from roots to roots, organized by the Department of English of Ulubedia College, I, on behalf of the department, welcome you all after this lunch break once again in the second plenary session of the first day of the webinar. We started with the root discussion of the rhizomic reconfiguration of human identities, which is a subject of reconstruction. Here, we head on towards the root of the new possibilities where new rooms will get opened up, where we can find ourselves in new imaginary homelands. With this, we would love to invoke for that ruin where we can really meet as strangers, as human friends. And for this session, therefore, we have someone, yes, from absolutely a different part of the geographical locale of my belonging, but it is the faculty of our cordial human bond that has established so far by our academic endeavor that makes this healthy communication possible, even on this virtual platform as well. And we hope the forthcoming academic discussions will touch upon the issues of subjectivity of human entities, issues of race, class, caste, and of course gender, and would open up new vistas of imaginings in the field of literature of representation. So, without making further delay, let me introduce the distinguished speaker of this session, Professor Esra Mirze Santesso ma'am. Professor Esra Mirze Santesso ma'am is an associate professor in English at the University of Georgia. She's the author of Disorientation, Muslim Identity in Contemporary Anglophone Literature, and the co-editor of Islam and Post-Colonial Literature. Her essays have appeared in a variety of journals, including the Journal of Religion and Literature, Critical Muslim, Post-Colonial Interventions, the Comparatist and Post-Colonial Text. Her interview with Orhan Pamuk, the Nobel Prize winner for literature in the year 2006, came out in PMLA. She teaches courses on post-colonial theory, human rights narratives, and immigrant literature. And today, the title of her topic is Female Subjectivity in Halal Fiction. So before ma'am's talk, I would like to mention something that after her talk, followed by the interactive session, of course, we will just head on towards the third technical session of the day. And in this regard, I would request our two presenters to be ready in our studio with their respective papers and presentations. Sudipta Banerjee and Parvati MS ma'am. Please be ready with your presentations, and I would also like to request Santesso ma'am to chair the sessions, of course, after your gracious presentation. So it's time for you, and the entire stage is yours. It's over to you, ma'am. Completely.
Thank you so much. Introduction, and Debola, it's so lovely to see you. One of the things of this pandemic is that we're able to, in a very strange way, connect through technology to places that we've never been to. So thank you again for that introduction. Great to see you again. I'm a big fan of your work. I have heard your research, and it's wonderful to be here to join you today. I also would like to extend my thanks to the organizer conference, and of course for the kind invitation that Dr. Sandeep Deloy has sent me to be a part of this wonderful experience. So without further ado, I'm going to start my talk. I want to make a couple of observations to kind of set the stage for this talk. I am going to talk about what has been a wonderful discovery for me, which is this new notion of halal literature, which can be seen as a subcategory of Islamic writing. And in my talks with other people, colleagues, and scholars across the globe, I have been trying to find more examples of this literature. And today I'm going to specifically focus on two writers. If you have any other suggestions for me to consider in the future, I would be very open to have a conversation and add your examples to my list as well. So let me go ahead and share my screen to make sure that we will have a little bit of a visual. Let's see. Nope. Okay. Let me try to call my PowerPoint again because it is not recognizing. Okay, let's do view. Okay, and share screen. No, it's not recognizing my PowerPoint. And we already rehearsed, which is really strange.
Ma'am, in that case, you can go on verbally. There could be no problem.
Okay, so I'm just gonna, yes, I only had some quotes and visuals that might have been helpful, but
okay, it's
I'm just
absolutely
gonna,
all right.
Yeah, I'm just gonna take
eagerly waiting to listen to you, ma'am. Yeah.
Okay, all right. So, in the broadest sense, has a history to the 7th century, starting with biographies of the Prophet, as well as the collections of hadiths and sunnahs, which were translated into Western languages as early as the Middle Ages and maintained a wide European circulation during the Renaissance. Recently, however, with the post-colonial push, contemporary Muslim writing on both sides of the Atlantic has entered into the literary mainstream to an unprecedented degree, inhabiting various and diverse subfields. You might be familiar with subcategories such as Black writing, diasporic writing, multi-ethnic literature, literature. What I would like to talk about today is two specific types of Muslim writing that have taken root in Britain and in the United States, namely post-secular fiction and halal fiction. These both engage with religious themes and subjectivities in distinct ways, in cases in
I would request the audience to bear with us. There is a connectivity issue. That's why our distinguished speaker who has lost the connection. So to fix the issue, we beg pardon and we are in want of a few moments. So we request our audience to please bear with us for a few moments.
I'm sorry, I think I had connection trouble, and I'm going to go
Yes,
ahead and...
yes, and you can just go ahead. Yeah,
Yes, okay.
just go on.
I'm basically talking about two different kinds of Islamic writing. One I name as post-secular writing, and the other one is halal writing, which is something that I have grown an interest in the last few years. So novelists working in the post-secular Muslim tradition, such as Monica Ali, Leila Halabi, Hanif Qureshi, focus specifically on diasporic subjects who feel a need to reconcile between religious heritage and national belonging. The authors of this group are keen to shed light on the disorienting nature of a negotiated subjectivity in an alien environment. Yet, rather than presenting Islam as an obstacle to integration, they depict religious belief as a source of positive power. In doing so, they emphasize the individual's role in creating a flexible version of Islam that challenges religious hegemonies based on universal dogmas, giving shape to a different kind of Islamic consciousness, one that allows for, and indeed strengthens personal autonomy through introspection. Halal fiction, on the other hand, follows a more provocative literary strategy. This vein of Muslim writing is less interested in showing Islam as a source of individual empowerment or in affirming personal agency. Instead, Islam appears as a forceful, indeed irresistible ideology that urges the individual into a general withdrawal from the secular world. In doing so, they attempt to destabilize the novel genre by subverting its secular roots and discarding its dialogic attributes. In the remainder of my talk today, I will turn to two examples from Britain and the USA, namely Leila Abulala's Minaret and Zakia's Footsteps, to further explore the issues at stake. So I'm going to start with Leila Abulala, and she is a Sudanese-British author. Her first novel, which is titled The Translator, published in 1999. When it came out, it was praised by a number of Muslim scholars for depicting a very interesting Islamic way of representing faith and rituals that lead to different modes of living. Ferial Ghazal, who actually coined the term halal, praises Leila Abulala, saying that, quote, "She delights us by the individual tone she adopts while merging in the fold of the community, showing us that there's plenty of room for an Arab Islamic womanism that is not at all a replica of Western feminisms." So again, for Ghazal, Abulala's piety-based gender politics paved the way towards a new literary category, which she labeled halal writing. Even though Ghazal initially used the term in a tongue-in-cheek manner to describe Abulala's portrayal of religiously permissible conduct for pious women, the term quickly caught on among critics and scholars alike, designating a particular type of fiction that promotes a religiously sanctioned worldview, one meant to fit with an Islamic understanding of social relations and culture. Now, today I'm going to talk about Abulala's second novel called Minaret, published in 2005. This novel culminated her position as a halal writer. Many critics noted how the book subverted conventional expectations about the nature of Islamic religious conversion. So indeed, the protagonist here, her journey from a young, modern, secular woman in Sudan to a devout, submissive Muslim in England, attracted attention for its divergence from the familiar pattern of self-actualization featured in other highly successful works by Muslim Anglophone authors, as opposed to, say, writers such as Hanif Qureshi and Monica Ali, whose protagonists often move towards a discovery of secular freedom. Abulala's protagonist in this novel is pulled into Islam as she tries to cope with her declining social and economic status after her relocation in London. Najwa, this is the name of the protagonist, eventually withdraws from public life to some extent and escapes into anonymity as a domestic worker hired by an Arab family. During this time, she discovers she's attracted to the younger brother of her employer, a practicing Muslim, equally disillusioned with his marginalization in the West. But once that relation is discovered by the family, Najwa backs away from her love interest, and this is very interesting. She accepts a payment from the family, which she thinks will be instrumental for her trip to go to Mecca for a pilgrimage, on the condition of ending her relationship. So very iffy ethics there. It's not necessarily the higher moral standards that we would expect from a more devout religious person. Now I'm going to move on to do some comparison with the other novel, which is Zakiya's Footsteps. Abulala's highbrow halal fiction finds a more mass market counterpart a decade later on this side of the Atlantic. Atlanta resident Zakiya's If I Should Speak trilogy, a young adult series that focuses on the Muslim community in the US, was described by bloggers as pure halal entertainment, penned by the most established author in Islamic fiction. So the books from this trilogy were adopted as part of the multicultural curriculum in American high schools and were praised for accurately depicting the minority experience through the creation of a compound sense of being the other in race, religion, and gender. Like Abuela, Zakiya treats religion as an overriding component of identity and filters female morality through an Islamic lens. In the book that I'm talking about, which is called Footsteps, which is the final installment of the trilogy, we meet Sarah as the protagonist. She's a white Muslim convert who experiences a crisis of faith after she finds out about her husband's decision to take a second wife. Sarah initially regards this act as an unforgivable betrayal and a personal insult. At first, she thinks that this is something that she cannot live with, and indeed she embarks on a spiritual quest. But with the help of the other women in the community, she starts to realize that her piety is all that she needs to get through this predicament. She decides to forgive Ishmael, her husband, and even resolve to actively help him restore his relationship with the other woman, which will be the second wife. She understands that her initial reaction, her desire for equal standing and a certain level of independence, was wrong. She was the one betraying her husband by questioning his unilateral decision, not the other way around. Over and over, the narrative advocates polygamy as halal and a desirable alternative for the pious Muslim woman. So in my talk, I want to raise two questions. One, the first one, does halal as a category destabilize the liberal secular roots of the novel? In other words, does halal writing provide a fresh platform to discuss faith in secular realist terms, or does it abandon secularism completely to advocate for faith-based subjectivities? So just to step back a little bit, when I ask this question, I am not claiming that religion is not a fit topic for the novel genre. Clearly, there are many examples of novels written about religion, anything ranging from the conversion narratives of the Victorian era to the Christian sentimental literature of the Second and Third Great Awakenings. As well, there are novels that spotlight deeply religious characters, as we see in the works of Gustave Flaubert, Henry Fielding, Emily Bronte. The examples are abundant. Rather, I'm interested in how we reconcile the dialogic nature of the novel with works built around what Sadia Abbas describes as theological formal imperatives. That is, novels which openly seek to convert novelistic narrative modes to religious ends. So then the question that I'm raising today is halal novel an oxymoron? The second question that I want to interrogate has to do with the representation of female agency. What type of feminism or womanism does halal fiction really promote? Now, a number of critics, including Marta Cariello, Christine Sizemore, and Peter Morey, praise Minaret for advocating a new type of female subjectivity that repudiates Western modes of freedom, thus paving the way towards what some are pleased to call Islamic feminism. Women like Najwa, according to Munir Kuzian, invite us to challenge the normative feminist assumptions about women's agency by showing the futility of binary terms of resistance and subordination. Since Najwa chooses to embrace Islam on her own accord, the argument goes, she engages with a type of feminism that may look different from Western models of resistance, but nonetheless participates in a feminist construction of gender in line with Islamic ethics. I'm not so sure about that. Perhaps such reasoning echoes Sabah Mahmood's redefinition of female agency as a way of inhabiting norms, an idea I will revisit later in the paper. For now, suffice it to say that equating feminism with conformity gets us in murky waters. If there is no resistance to structures that keep women in subordinate positions, can they really be feminism, Islamic or otherwise? Are we prepared to accept women choosing subordinate positions as feminists? Can freedom from freedom be deemed as a viable feminist stance? My reading of Abuela and Zakiya contests such interpretations. Rather, I make the case that the representation of the two protagonists as self-negating beings who willfully capitulate their agency to prove their unwavering piety somewhat ironically upholds the Orientalist and imperialist versions of Islam, and in particular, plays to Western notions of the submissive Muslim woman. Now, so first, I'm going to go back to the question that I raised about the relationship between religion and the novel genre. I will try to answer that question by way of introducing secularism as an important foundation for the novelistic genre and the way it kind of brings forth these important notions about autonomy, freedom, and independence. So, the delicate balance between secularism, liberalism, and dialogism that marks most traditional realist novels is complicated once religion is incorporated not only as a thematic arc, but as a structural scheme, and that is meant to make every aspect of the novel evidence of the workings of Allah. For Salman Rushdie, whose works prominently feature religion, religious discourse and literary aesthetics occupy separate spheres. Here's a direct quote from Rushdie, quote, "Whereas religion seeks to privilege one language above all others, one set of values above all others, one text above all others, the novel has always been about the way in which different languages, values, and narratives quarrel. And that is a very important word in defining the language, the heteroglossia of the novel. For Rushdie, this critical act of separation essentially marks the novel as a secular genre, an idea that surfaces repeatedly in the works of the early 20th century theorists of the novel, Emam Bahtin, Ian Watt, and George Lukács all point to an indissoluble link between the realist novel and secular thought. According to Watt, for example, the rise of the novel coincides with the rise of the modern secular man, for whom, quote, the pursuit of truth is conceived as a wholly individual matter, logically independent of the tradition of past thought. So theological imperatives are therefore not central to the novel and may indeed run counter to the aims of the genre. What the realist novel does best is to capture and represent this form of consciousness, secular consciousness, with all its triumphs and failures. And when religion is introduced as an integral part of a character in a realist novel, it is generally done without privileging a transcendental truth that invalidates the significance of all other social and economic systems. And I think this is very important because in Halal, religion appears as an overriding component of identity, but in the realist novel, especially realist secular novel tradition, there are many different kinds of components that converge that contribute to the subject formation of each character. So at the heart of this question of secularism lies the difference between monologism and dialogism. For Bakhtin, the novel represents multiple types of consciousness to articulate a range of ideological positions. His formulation of dialogical ontology rests on the existence of this assemblage that leads to coexistential ethics. In a dialogic environment, truth becomes something negotiated and debated. And I think that is the problem that I find with halal fiction, that there's nothing debated, nothing is being talked about openly, but it becomes a dictate of the tenets that are embraced by religious, pious subjects. For a majority of critics, then, the truth function of a religious text, coupled with its internally closed, divinely inspired commandments, remain at odds with the dialogic discourse of the novel. Plainly, in halal fiction, the secular roots of the novel are pushed aside, not because halal prioritizes faith-based subjectivities, but because it silences dialogism by promoting a single worldview that resists narrative quarrel, to circle back to Rushdie. In Minaret, for example, we see Najwa shying away from connecting with other women who attends Quranic lessons at the mosque. She realizes that while she enjoys taking tajweed lessons, which are learning the correct pronunciation of the Quran, and this is very much based on repetition. So people gather to repeat the language of the Quran to learn the correct pronunciation. So she very much enjoys those lessons. But when it comes to other types of lessons offered at the mosque, such as ijtihad, which is using reason to come up with a solution for a problem, Najwa shies away from those kinds of debates and leaves the scene. She remains to be silent. I'm going to introduce a quote from the novel, and I think this will illustrate the point that I'm trying to make. Quote, "The sisters, especially the young British-born ones and the converts, like to discuss and give their opinions, but I become fragmented and deflated in discussions. I never know which point of view I support. I find myself agreeing with whoever is speaking or the one I like the best." End quote. Najwa finds assurance in the monologic structure of religion and does not reach out to others to engage in critical exchanges. For her, the dialogic energy and curiosity of Western Muslims is distracting and vaguely vulgar. She's content with adopting a religious persona based on a mechanistic performance of piety. Her disregard for exchange eventually pushes her towards a fundamentalist understanding of spirituality that resists personal reflection and reciprocal interpretation. And Abuela herself does nothing to critique such an absence outside of her novels. So she gave an interview to Charles Larson, and in this interview she states, and I quote, "I want to write fiction that reflects Islamic logic. Fictional worlds where cause and effect are governed by Muslim rather than non-Muslim rationale." End quote. Abuela has a clear agenda. Her voluntary erasure of dissent closes all doors to productive antagonisms. Now, going back to the other novel, Zakiya's Footsteps, what it does is it does a very similar kind of a structuring of the novel that dismisses dialogism and replaces it with religious didacticism. So the protagonist, Sarah, as I said, finds out about her husband's desire to take a second wife. At first, she entertains the idea of leaving him. However, the other women in the community quickly rebuke her actions for being selfish. Her friend and kind of the mentor she adopts, her name is Nusabai, she encourages Sarah to be patient and to remain inert. She says, quote, "Dua, faith, patience, and most importantly, prayer. If nothing else, polygamy teaches you to love Allah and to be grateful for his favors. Without either one of those, we have no hope." End quote. There's an effort here to equate polygamy with piety, implying that a true Muslim woman would not be bothered by a ritual sanctioned by the Prophet himself. But there is even more troubling judgment here about female autonomy. By encouraging inaction through passive submission to Allah, her mentor dismisses Sarah's feelings and discards her individuality, reducing her to silence. There is no exchange here, no dialogic argument, no narrative quarrel. Nothing perhaps summarizes Zakiya's resistance to dialogism rather than her defense of polygamy that she offered in her personal blog. She writes, and I quote, "Polygamy is something inside of the Quran. You don't have to live in it, but it's something that Allah allows, so it must be good." So that took me on a journey of soul searching, and I began to see with my heart instead of my eyes, because that's how we see. So be careful when you always see negativity in something halal. The problem is your heart, not the situation. If you cannot see the beauty of polygamy, then you have a heart problem. End quote. So her logic, it is in the Quran, so it must be good, is precisely the type of sensibility that resists dialogic exploration. In this case, even questioning polygamy is automatically dismissed as a sign of moral transgression. The silencing of dissent essentially negates the power of the autonomous individual and creates a clear tension between the liberal realist novel tradition and halal writing. While the novel commits to polyvocality and facilitate empathy, halal writing finds its strength in acting as propaganda and celebrations of dogma. So this is how I wanted to respond to the first question that I raised about the secular roots of the novel genre. Now I want to move on with the question of feminism that is being advocated in halal literature. There is no one way of being a feminist. Feminists need not follow any one particular ideology or adopt any particular belief sets. But when secularism is dismissed for the sake of piety and dialogism is compromised on a structural level, it is likely that the feminist possibilities of a text are diminished. Abuela and Zakiya have been critically celebrated as pioneers for promoting an Islamic model of feminism. But we also have to reconsider the ways in which these texts advocate for a limiting of female agency. I want to talk about a particular moment in Minaret, which is consistently discussed by scholars as a sign of Najwa's surrogate feminism, the moment when Najwa decides to veil herself. Obviously, there's abundant discussion in the academy about the Islamic veil and what it represents. Suffice it to say that the veil is a vexed question. In certain contexts, putting on the veil might be seen as a feminist act. In others, it is removing the piece of that clothing that marks a woman as a feminist. But regardless of whether a woman is putting on or taking off the hijab, for it to be considered a feminist act, it seems to me that the enterprise has to bring some sort of empowerment to the individual and display a rejection of power structures that restrict women's participation in public and political discourses. As Anwar Majid points out, whether veiled or not, women's conditions are determined not by the clothes they wear, but by the degree to which they manage to forge an identity for themselves outside discourses of modernity or religious authenticity. But in Minaret, there is no such affirmation. And I want to give you another quote to illustrate this point. Quote, this is right after Najwa puts on the veil and leaves her house for the first time. As I was walking home, I walked smiling, self-conscious of the new material around my face. I passed the window of a shop, winced at my reflection, and then thought, not bad, not so bad. Around me was a new gentleness. The builders who had leered down at me from scaffoldings couldn't see me anymore. I was invisible, and they were quiet, end quote. Now, this is read as a redemptive act by Marta Cariello, who writes that Najwa's decision to wear a headscarf is actually a liberating gesture, in that she openly declares she's no longer going to be signified by the intruding, sexualizing gaze of male Western hegemony. Shirin Edwin, another critic, concurs with that reading, as she argues that Abuela describes a dimension of Islamic feminism as the protagonists ostensibly draw justification and motivation for their choices and decisions from Islam. But Najwa's initial reaction to her own reflection contradicts this liberation interpretation. She feels a self-conscious unease, which makes her wince. Certainly, it's true that she had been bothered by the way men had gazed at her in a sexual way. Now she is unacknowledged by them, and their indifference is marked by silence. Her response to this development, I was invisible and they were quiet, is hardly the beginning of a new agency. If anything, that unseen self brings about a gentleness, but that gentleness is not self-driven, nor even achieved through a spiritual introspection, but instead granted to her by her disappearance from the former and more interactive life. In this sense, Najwa continues to remain an object whose meaning is fixed by the Western male gaze. Her adoption of the way is hardly an emancipatory choice or a sophisticated entry into a debate about secularism or an attempt to revise the West's misconceptions about Muslim women. Rather, it's an attempt to mark her avowed otherness, to depart a debate. Now, the way Najwa is drawn to invisibility and Sarah to silence illustrates a striking irony. Despite their apparent initial interest in correcting Orientalist perceptions of Islam in the West, the pious Muslim women in these two novels embrace a gendered subjectivity that plays right into the hands of right-wing interpretations of Islam. Taking umbrage to such inimical readings, while Hassan notes the way Abuela uses invisibility in her novels. He says, and I quote, "I think people misread the way invisibility and think that this makes them feminist subjects." Abuela, on the other hand, responds to these accusations saying that people read invisibility in a negative way when it needs to be filtered through a positive lens. She says, "I meant it in an entirely positive way, that she no longer has to put up with the way men were looking at her." And yet this particular passage, regardless of the author's intent, portrays Najwa not as a socially active and independent Muslim woman, but an escapist who sounds more apologetic than empowered. The problem is not that Najwa decides to convert to Islam, but rather that she emerges as a caricature of the Islamic convert, where voice and reason are forfeited for the sake of silent faith. This is not taking agency, it is relinquishing it. Zakia's writing also participates in these inner contradictions as she upholds and validates patriarchal structures in her construction of Muslim female subjectivity. So much so that at points, the book verges on parody. The central character, Ishmael, who is the husband to Sarah and decides to take a second wife, defends polygamy as a natural male inclination sanctioned by Islam. His appeal to Sarah reflects several levels of rationalization, each more problematic than the last. He first expresses his desire to take a second wife on the basis of male privilege. Quote, "A man needed no compelling reason to marry someone else. Of course, a woman wouldn't understand that." His chauvinism then turns into a condescending emotional appeal. Quote, "It was because he was so pleased with Sarah, so complete with her, so at peace with their relationship that he wanted the same, even if something only slightly comparable, with someone else." And then at some point, he even contemplates the notion of Sarah divorcing him and choosing another husband for herself. And he goes completely paralyzed by the thought that this could be an option for her, that he could never allow such a thing to go through. So what is most striking here is that, excuse me, Ishmael's positions are not satirized or condemned or even treated as suspect. These appeals, which seem to endorse a masculinist version of Islam, leaves no room for female dissent. These are presented as fundamentally reasonable. By the logic of the novel, Sarah has no choice but to surrender her agency, not only to male authority, but also to the authority of women protecting patriarchy. This is a complete disavowal of personal liberty as incompatible with Islam. This is not feminism, nor an Islamic version of feminism. So I want to start to conclude my paper and see what kinds of lessons can be learned from halal fiction. When I was writing this paper, I found myself thinking about C.E. Rashid's inescapable question. Are we forming any sort of conversation when we speak about Muslims in an ostensibly secular academic settings? Put that way, probably not. But it seems just as important to ask whether authors can speak for Islam effectively when the version of Islam represented in their works closes all possibility of dialogue, thus constructing a futile binary between halal writing and non-halal writing, perhaps something that can be labeled as haram writing. I want to close by an anecdote. So when I was growing up in Istanbul, Turkey, the veil was banned by the liberal regime, which feared creeping Islamism as a growing promotion of Sharia over the secular constitution. To prevent the veil from becoming a rallying symbol, the Higher Education Authority announced in 1982 its policy to remove female students with headscarves from university lecture halls. This pronouncement was supported by the Supreme Administrative Court, which stated that, quote, beyond being a mere innocent practice, wearing the headscarf is in the process of becoming a symbol of a vision that is contrary to the freedoms of women and the fundamental principles of the Republic, end quote. Now, at that time, people like my mother, working at universities as academics, who believed in upholding democratic rights for women to have access to education regardless of their political views, directly defied the government's decree by refusing to remove female students with headscarves from the classrooms. Some of these academics later became subjects of investigations due to their resistance to comply. But for them, allowing hijabi students in the classroom was not only a matter of human rights, but also a way to empower them through education, to help them make informed decisions based on their own terms. Hijab, in other words, had become a feminist issue. Let's fast forward 20, 30 years. Today, when I go to Istanbul, I step on a subway train, and most of the women wear the hijab. And there's increasing pressure for secular women to veil themselves if they want government positions or promotions. So now, freedom not to wear the hijab has become a feminist issue. That's why I find it interesting to think about recent works emerging in the academy about Islamic feminism. Miriam Cook, Margot Badran, Amina Wadud. These are all very important scholars that are making headways with the notion of Islamic feminism. I want to focus for 2 minutes on one of these Islamic scholars, Sabah Mahmoud, for example, looks at the Dawa movement in Egypt in order to redefine female agency as the practice of inhabiting norms rather than resisting norms. She says, women who gather at the mosque to discuss the Quran against the wishes of their husbands are agents who are engaged in practices of self-realization by inhabiting particular religious norms as a part of their daily life. This is not freedom performed through acts of subversion of given norms, but freedom as a practice of belonging. In other words, Mahmoud presents these women as independent and active agents for the way they defy their secular husbands. Now, while Mahmoud deserves praise for her resolve to think about female agency outside the Western norm, she still does not present a viable model for pious feminism, primarily because she fails to account for community or domestic pressures or religious dogmatism. As we see in Footsteps, ritualized readings of the Quran can rather quickly become ceremonial faux discoveries of established truths and doctrines in a way to consolidate collective identity. In the end, both Najwa and Sarah are inevitably drawn into a particularly harsh and anti-liberal version of Muslim femininity as they participate in women's communities. With this in mind, I see a clear divergence between post-secular Muslim writing, again, which is talking about Muslims and their critical engagement with their belief as a positive source of empowerment, and halal fiction, which invites Islam through a dogmatic lens and acts as propaganda. And we, as critics, should be very careful as we promote halal, which makes other literature appear as if they are haram. Thank you very much for your time. And I'm very happy to take questions and to make some clarifications on some of the points that I mentioned in my paper.
Yeah, thank you so very much, ma'am, for giving us your time, precious time, and for making such enthralling this session entirely an enthralling one. And we really loved the way you, in a very organized way, the way you were interacting, the way you presented your paper. You just started right from the rise of this particular genre and the typical discursive practices right from the medieval period, and the journey of the novel as a genre, and the cross-section, the differentiation of it between the post-secular fiction and the halal fiction. And you also referred to the sensibilities, the literary sensibilities of Monica Ali, of Hanif Qureshi, more specifically their diasporic sensibilities, and in contrast to the halal fiction that represents or comes up with the idea of Islam as a kind of an irresistible ideology. And next, you referred to Leila Abulala's novel, A Minaret, that came out in the year 1998. And you also made a comparative study, and where you are talking about or referring to how this particular narrative discourse problematizes the very orthodox conceptions and foundations of the identity formation and the like. And then you head on towards this comparative study of the novel of Zakia. The name of the novel is Footsteps. And then
Yes.
you again came to this very point of very important point of the rise of the novel as a genre, more specifically in the 18th century, and the relationship of the representation of a novel, of novel as a genre, with that very foundation or ideology of religion. And you also came up with the problematic that you are trying to deal with, that whether halal as a novel as an oxymoron, and the kind of womanism and feminism that it promotes, and the way of resistance and subordination, whether they are any kind of a dialectic. And we can see that from your organized, and you also came up with the foundation, with the findings of your research, and we really loved the way you presented your paper, and how we have this kind of a dialectic between this halal and non-halal writing, and how this particular literary genre resists or helps to resist the norms of discursive practices. So from this, ma'am, personally, I do have two questions. You may say this is a question or observations. As you are talking about the central focus of your talk is on the subjectivity of women in halal fiction. So I would like to refer to Can the Subaltern Speak of Gayatri Chakraborty's Spivak. Spivak is not only talking about the marginalization of the people who are economically weaker, who are not standing at the center of the society, but in the end of this particular essay, she's talking about, she's referring to Bhuvaneshwari Devi's suicide note, and she's also referring to the fact that women are further under the shadow. So here is the subjugation of women with regard to the domination of the patriarchy, and their kind of subjectification that we find in the literature of representation, be it a diasporic writing or any kind of a novelistic discourse, or the narrative of a poetic symphony that also gets reflected in the poetry of Kamala Das, the Indian English poetess. So my question is that, do you think that this representation of women in halal fiction does it really advocates this particular word that women are further under the shadow. More specifically, the novels that you are focusing over here, the minaret and the footsteps, and the narrative discourse that these two novelists, in particular, they are trying to establish here or come up with.
Thank you for that question. It's really making me think a lot here. But of course, let's go back to the very foundational question that Gayatri Spivak asked us: can the subaltern women speak? Right? And on the one hand, I think some of the Western critics are eager to embrace these diasporic writers, to say, look at these subaltern women speaking, writing these novels, and presenting some kind of a subjectivity that we are not very accustomed to seeing in the West. That these are Muslim women who choose to put on the veil, that they are not forced, these are their own expressions, and they become liberated, and they become, in a way, the expressions of what we call now Islamic feminism, a term that I can talk a little bit about later, which is kind of problematic, but it's also helpful. But anyway, my sense is that, well, yes, that is certainly happening. And that is the legacy of halal writing, which is to promote these kinds of different female subjectivities. And that's very important, because womanism or feminism is not just one thing. But let us be careful, because when we call these women feminists, then what we're saying is that the subaltern doesn't have to speak, that it's okay for them to remain silent. Because in both of the examples that I used, in both Minaret and Footsteps, the women choose silence, and they choose self-subordinating positions so that the community is happy with their decision and that they're not ostracized. So there's definitely pressure there. So even though it's their choice, can we just say, if they choose subordinate positions, if they choose freedom from freedom, can they be feminist? No. So what I would say is that in halal fiction, we have a different form of womanism, but this womanism is not feminism. And I think what you bring up in terms of class structures, that is very important in understanding Spivak, is also true in this halal writing too. One of the reasons why Najwa is drawn to religion, and I don't want to make this really kind of problematic observation, but it is discussed in the novel, is that Najwa becomes more and more economically troubled, that she starts losing her money, she starts losing her savings, and she becomes a domestic, and she gets more and more pulled into religion because she finds a sense of community. Again, I don't want to make the connection that, it's only the economically disenfranchised that finds religion, some kind of spiritual comfort in religion. That is not what I'm saying. But I think economic and class structure is also very important factors in thinking through religious subjectivities.
Yeah. So subalternity, this question of subalternity, I think, is more a matter of acceptance on the part of women's subjectivity and the representation in the literature as well. Another thing that I would like to an opinion that I want from you, that this very genre of halal fiction that you are representing, or you're trying to focus on, this is absolutely a new kind of a genre for the people of East. And why would you, and I personally found it so very interesting, and from the chat box it gets very much evident that you have lit up so many candles as to this and the larger audience that we are having through this sessions from the very morning, and for this particular session in particular, I would like to say that there are so many observations and questions for this interactive session. So why do you want this particular, do you really want this particular genre of this halal fiction should have an exposure in the Indian classrooms? If so, then why?
I think halal literature should belong to any kind of a classroom. But here's the problem that I have. Zakia's footsteps, because, you know, I live very close to Atlanta, and Zakia herself is from Atlanta. So there's like a general curriculum in high schools here in the state of Georgia. And this book has been adopted to show Muslim subjectivities to non-Muslim people as like something that they put on a pedestal. So rather than engage with this book critically, they're exoticizing it and tokenizing it as saying like, this is how Muslim Americans look like, and this is how they feel. That is a problem. So yes, halal literature should belong to any kind of a classroom, but the way we read it is very important. It should not be fetishized, it should not be tokenized, but it should be read critically to understand what is at stake. I think one of the things in post-colonial literature, you know, there's so much emphasis on hybridity. But when we think about hybridity, it's all about race and nationality. It can't be about class. It can't be about religion, right? So that kind of discussion about religious subjectivity, which is so important in the post-secular age that we live in, has been absent from post-colonial studies. And that's why literature like halal literature is kind of paving the way to make religious identity more prominent in post-colonial studies. And that's why it belongs to the classroom. But again, the way we read it and the way we frame it is very important. It should not be seen as something that emblematizes all Muslim experiences across the globe.
So that's actually wonderful. Wonderfully, you just provided us with the answer and you came up with your observation. So, ma'am, we have a few questions from our students. So, could we proceed with this? Okay.
Of course.
Okay. Thank you. Our first question is from Shomini Hajra. Her question is, ma'am, may I ask that why halal fiction is within quotes halal fiction, but not just the same as others? Also, I would like to ask how the sense of marginalization is hinted in this zone.
So I really tried to make the point, and I didn't have my PowerPoint slides, so it's very easy to miss that. But I really wanted to make the point that when I say halal fiction, I do not mean fiction that talks about religion. So any kind of fiction can talk about religion, and it's important. But what I'm trying to do is to juxtapose two different forms of religious discussions. One is the post-secular novel, and that is my term. Not everybody agrees on this terminology, but I'm going to introduce what I think is at stake here. One is the post-secular one, which discusses religion in a much more of a secular sense, in a much more of an empowering sense, in a positive sense. The other one is halal, which is, again, talking about religion, but specifically thinking through things in more subordinate ways, where the women are feeling self-obeying and kind of disavowing their empowerment that comes from religion. I'll give you a very quick example. The very first sentence of Minaret says, "I have come down in the world." Okay, so when you read that, a statement coming from a woman who has just chosen, who has just embraced Islam, it's not a very positive message, is it? I have come down in the world. So what I'm trying to say is that maybe one way to think about religion is to frame it in a way that is more empowering, that is about critical engagement with Islam, that is about thinking through post-secular issues that are important in subject formation, as opposed to halal literature, where Islam is being dictated and propagated without any kind of self-reflection and self-reflexivity. And that's why and again, halal is not my term. I totally borrowed it from Faryal Ghazul, who was the first person to describe Abulala's novel as halal novel. But it caught on. There are a lot of critics out there who talk about it. Claire Chambers, Fadia Fakir, Peter Morey. So as you can see, it's kind of spreading in the critical realm
as people are thinking through these issues. And as far as the marginalization is concerned, I think in the minaret, for example, you realize that Najwa completely withdraws from the daily life that she once used to have. And that's a choice. And what happens to her once she gets relocated in England is that she used to be a party girl. She used to go to the university in Sudan. She was very secular. She had a boyfriend. But once she comes to England, and realizes that she can't replicate that life for a variety of reasons, she withdraws from everyday existence. She becomes a domestic, not that there's anything wrong about it, but she limits her presence to the domestic realm of her employer and the mosque. And she refuses to interact with any other being, except for a brief time. Her boyfriend comes from Sudan, and she tries to maintain a relationship, but she realizes that it's not going anywhere. So her marginalization, she's economically marginalized, religiously marginalized, she's marginalized in terms of her gender. So there are multiple layers there.
Thank you, ma'am. Thanks for your answer. We have another question, and this question is from Dr. Veera Ravindra. And the question is, what do the writers of halal fiction glorify, and the suffering female protagonist or an outspoken protagonist? Please elaborate, ma'am.
I think I will be in the minority when I say this, but I do think that in the end, even though they're saying, oh, we're trying to make Muslim women visible, what they're advocating is a suffering female protagonist. Again, going back to that very first sentence, I have come down in the world. In other places in Minaret, Najwa, the protagonist, says, I accept my sentence. And I keep thinking, what is your sentence? Is Islam your sentence? If that is the way you're thinking about Islam, it is not a very empowering statement. So I think that one of the things is, yes, halal fiction is making women, especially women who are subordinated, more visible. It is not letting them speak and choose autonomy and choose critical engagement to position themselves as feminist leaders of Muslim subjects.
Thank you, ma'am. Thanks for your answer. Our next question is from Devabrito Othikari. And the question is, can dialogicity, secularism by the desired way for women's emancipation only? How can we reflect the heterogeneous experience of the women across race, class, caste, and various religions?
Yes, absolutely. And that is what I'm criticizing halal literature doing anyway, which is, again, religion is presented as an overriding component of identity, which is very problematic because it disregards the fact that identity is an assemblage of things, that one's religious affiliation is as important as national affiliation, racial affiliation, economic affiliation. So once we start talking about identity in very one-dimensional ways and disregard these different kinds of layers that contribute to the making of an individual, I think we get in very problematic and murky waters. And in terms of dialogism and secularism as a desired way for women's emancipation, I think that those are important factors for any kind of multi-ethnic, multicultural communities. It is not just for women, but it is for any community who have a diverse range of subjects embodied within their structure. And I think one of the problems that we see, at the beginning, we were just talking about the impending elections here in the United States. Once we forget the fact that any kind of community has a plurality of subject positions and a plurality of immigrants and experiences, then we come up with a myth that doesn't really exist. So secularism is, I think, very important for I hate the word tolerance, so instead I'm going to use acceptance and coexistence of any community. It's not a question of a gendered identity only.
Thank you, ma'am. Thanks for your answer. And here is a compliment that is there in my personal chat box. I'm just reading it out and passing it on to ma'am. This is from Sheikh Sagir Ali, who is an assistant professor of Midnapur College. And he's saying that I'm an admirer of Esra Mirze Santesso, ma'am. She's a gem, and he's just giving the Department of English of Uluberia College a big thanks for inviting you, and we are really fortunate enough to have you in this session. And Sheikh Sagir Ali sir is having a question, and the question is, how can you see the recent attacks on Abuela by critics such as Sadia Abbas and Wael Hassan, who have focused on the pious passivity displaced by Minaret's protagonist Majwa, and the way the novel as a whole appears to endorse types of female renunciation and doctrinal orthodoxy favored by the stricter Salafi theology currently gaining ground in the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia.
Right. First of all, thank you so much for your kind words. I'm really flattered. And it's so good to be here and to have these wonderful questions, which are making me sweat, but also learn a lot. So yes, I am very familiar with Wael Hassan. I came up with a couple of quotes in my paper from him. Also Sadia Abbas, whom I corresponded very briefly a few times as I was working on this paper. You're absolutely right. And this is one of the other things about, we talked about the tokenization of halal literature, right? Which this is presented as something that is mainstream, that is accepted, that is become almost like a representative of an entire culture that is so diverse and different across the globe. And of course, Najwa comes from the Salafi tradition, which is a lot more stricter. It advocates for going back to the original meaning of Islam, back to the days of Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad. So it's a lot more stricter in its representation of religion. That is not the same case with Zakiya, that her protagonist, even though she's a white convert, has much more of a basis in different kinds of African permutations of Islam. But again, the problem here is how we're framing halal literature. Not that it's what's representing, but how we're framing it. If we think about it as being representative of all these other Muslims in the world, then what we're presenting a very slight, very small version of Islam that is not necessarily accepted as mainstream by different Muslim cultures. And Wael Hassan is absolutely right in calling out Abuela, saying, well, you're talking about female empowerment and female subjectivity, but look at all your characters. This is not just on Minaret, but also in Translator. They are always self-abating. They're always self-abasing. And they're always thinking about giving privilege to the mechanistic expressions of Islam rather than an internalization. In Translator, for example, the protagonist says, I'm in love with this white man, but I can't marry him before he converts to Islam. And the man says, well, I can't do that. I respect Islam, but I don't want to convert. And she says, just do it for my sake, even if it's just a ceremony, even if it's just like something you do superficially. I don't think this is really advocating for a kind of spirituality that we want to embrace.
Thank you, ma'am. Thanks for your answer. From now, ma'am, we are just heading on towards the third technical session of today's session, and I would like to request Shudipta Banerjee, the paper presenter, to be ready with her presentation. Sudipta Banerjee is an open research scholar. She has done her master's from Kaji Nazrul University, Asansol. Her area of interest includes culture studies, post-colonial studies, gender studies. And the title of her paper is Shaheen Bagh, A Boiling Cauldron, Mapping the Nation with its Nationalism and Gender Roles. So, ma'am, I would request you to chair the session. It's over to you, ma'am.
Shall I start now?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, everyone. I am Sudipta Banerjee, an open research scholar from West Bengal. Thanks to the Department of English, Uluberia College, for giving me the opportunity to share the platform. Thanks to the keynote speaker for setting the tune. The title of my paper is Shaheen Bagh, A Boiling Cauldron, Mapping the Nation with its Nationalism and Gender Roles. Where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, when knowledge is free, where the world has not been broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls. Into that heaven of freedom, my father, let my country awake. We all know the very famous line by Rabindranath Tagore. When we are born as a child, our mind is then like a blank slate, bearing no mark or sketch. We are not conscious during that time where we are born, where we are belonging to, in which country and nation we belong, in which country or nation we have taken birth. What is our citizenship? What is voter card? What is Aadhaar card? What are borders? Where they exist? What this nation stands for, etc. Then we are only aware of one safe place on this world, and that is our mother's lap. A child's first knowledge about nation to which he or she belongs comes first with the celebration of the Independence Day in his school, in his or her society, and places around him. The first time when he hears the national song, national anthem, he or she becomes aware that there is something that is called nation, and to be a part of this nation, one needs to have nationalism. The roots are the primary parameter of determining one's identity. This feeling of oneness with one's nation is generated within us through some powerful institution at the initial stage. The school plays a very vital role in shaping the nation and its people. Unity in diversity and respect, love and pride towards the nation by its citizen. The term nationalism in context of India has been understood and defined in many ways. It has been described as a state of mind in which supreme loyalty of the individual is due to the nation state. The line has been taken from Tara Chand, History of Freedom Movement in India, Volume 2. There it implies the identification of the state or nation with the people, where the characteristics of the people are homogeneous culture, living together in a close association or territory, sharing belief of a common destiny, etc. According to J.C. Johari in his book Indian Politics, 5th edition, 1996, the meaning of nationalism has its different connotations. If we examine the case of free versus subject people appeared in the modern period after the decline and fall of papacy and nation states of Europe took upon themselves that emerged as a reaction against the imperial system of the advanced European countries. Indian nationalism developed as a concept during India's freedom struggle against the British. Indian nationalism inclusive of its entire people, despite their diverse ethnic and religious background. As history present before us, that Indian nationalist struggle began in 1885 with the setting up of Indian National Congress, which steered new hopes and aspirations for independent India. Ranajit Guha, in his essay on some aspects of the historiography of colonial India, talks about this elitism in the historiography of Indian nationalism. He says, underquote, the historiography of Indian nationalism has for a long time been dominated by elitism, colonialist elitism, and bourgeois nationalist elitism. Both originated as the ideological product of the British rule in India, but have survived the transfer of power and been assimilated to neo-colonialist and new nationalist forms of discourse in Britain and India, respectively. We have passed almost 2 decades of the 21st century, and standing in this juncture, the concept of nationalism is becoming highly problematic and threatening. Quoting from Tagore's The Sunset of the Century, let us now take a look on the idea of nationalism that is prevalent in contemporary time. Underquote, the naked passion of the self-love of nation in its drunken delirium of greed is dancing to the clash of steel and howling horses of vengeance. The hungry self of the nation shall burn in a violence of fury from its shameless feeding, for it has made the world its food. Quote close. As it is defined earlier, that nationalism requires homogeneous characteristics, unifying thoughts and ideology, supreme loyalty. This very definition of nationalism bears the root of problem. Nationalism, while in its demand for homogeneous culture, is actually overlooking diversity and heterogeneity. Nationalism in today's context inspires a sense of aggression and posturing majoritarianism. Nationalism is now accompanied by a hostile attitude which involves the presence of other. This other can be another country, another religion, another caste, another individual who shares a different thought and ideology, who does not match with the contemporary nationalistic view. There is a constant atmosphere of hostility to galvanize the people against the national axis of India. In his essay, Nationalism in India, Tagore says that during British rule, India forgot her past glory, her spirit of love. She was taught that idolating of the nation is better than reverence for God and humanity. But she should unlearn this lesson. She should remember that the ideals of humanity are greater than mean and base nationalism. India had overcome this meanness in the past. She declared, Swadesha Bhuvanatrayam. What he means is to imagine the entire world as our own. Tagore took the view that since nationalism emerged in the post-religious laboratory of industrial capitalism, it was only an organization of politics and commerce that brings harvest of wealth or carnivals of materialism by spreading tentacles of greed, selfishness, power, and prosperity, or churning up the baser instincts of mankind and sacrificing in the process the moral man, the complete man, to make room for political and commercial man, the man of limited purpose. Tagore, the messianic poet, talked about imagining one world. Tagore was a believer in an interactive, a dialogic world given to a deep sense of sympathy, generosity, and mutuality, and in which nations would not be parochial, xenophobic, and centripetal, or guided by a mere selfishness and self-aggrandizement, but poised towards morally and politically enlightened community of nations through the espousal of a centrifugal outlook, multilateral imagination, principle of universality, and reciprocal recognition. Benedict Anderson, in his book Imagined Community, Reflection on the Origin and Sphere of Nationalism, defines nation as an imagined political community and imagined as both inherently limited and sovereign. He says it is imagined because the members of even the smallest nation will never know their fellow members, meet them, or even hear them, yet in the minds of each lives the image of their communion. Partho Chatterjee, another well-known figure who attempts a critique of Anderson's imagined communities in the first chapter of his book, The Nation and Its Fragments, 1993, which he titles as A Whole Imagined Community. Here he challenges the idea of nation as being imagined from certain modular forms. He argues that nationalism is not rooted on an identity, but rather on a difference of the modular forms of the nationalist society propagated by the modern West. In the beginning of the chapter, he explains that nationalism is viewed as dark, elemented, unpredictable force of primordial nature, threatening the orderly calm of our civilized life. Now, after talking about nationalism at a stretch, let me directly switch off to the focal point of my paper, Shaheen Bagh. Shaheen Bagh is no more a place, but a history in itself. Since December 2019, it has become the cynosure of the entire world for its protest against Citizenship Amendment Act. After 74 years of independence, the country once again saw the new struggle for freedom, embedded with the new spirit of nationalism. Here, the struggle for freedom is not from the colonizers, but what Frantz Fanon says, black skins, white marks. The people of Shaheen Bagh gathered to prove their nationality in front of the nation in which they live. The Shaheen Bagh protest was a siege in peaceful protest led by women, which began in response to the passage of the Citizenship Amendment Act (CAA) in both houses of Parliament of India on 11th December 2019 and the ensuing police intervention against students at Jamia Millia Islamia who were opposing the amendment. Protesters agitated not only against the citizenship issues of the CAA, National Registers of Citizens (NRC) and National Population Register (NPR), but also against police brutality, unemployment, poverty, and for women's safety. Mainly consisting of Muslim women, the protesters at Shaheen Bagh since 14th December 2019 blocked a road in New Delhi using non-violent resistance for 101 days as of 24th March 2020. It became the longest protest against CAA, NRC, NPR. The protest ended on 24th March 2020 as Delhi police vacated the site due to coronavirus pandemic. Why Steinbach attracted the attention of the globe? Because three-generation women came together to fight up their battle for existence. They stood with their spine straight, head high, strong-willed, balancing the wheels of home and the world very delicately and placing up their opinions in front of the world. The dadis of Steinbach caught special attention of everyone. At the age of 75, 85, 95, they came out of the domain and took active part in proving their existence. In many interviews, these women were saying that they have never faced the media before, but they are now doing so because they want the nation to identify them as their citizens and not in a position to prove them. Women who have always stayed behind curtain of kitchen and rooms now cross the dahlias of their house and face the world confidently. They are pointing out issues that the country is burning with in a manner as if they are demanding answers from the state itself. Their body language, their vocal tone, everything are worth commendable. A central element in the ideological justification of the British colonial rule was the criticism of the degenerate and barbaric social custom of Indian people sanctioned, or so it was believed by the religious tradition. In identifying this tradition as degenerate and barbaric, colonialist critics invariably repeated a long list of atrocities perpetrated on Indian women, applying the inner outer distinction to the matter of concrete day-to-day living separates the social space into ghar and bahir, the home and the world. The world is the external, the domain of the material. The home represents one's inner spiritual self, one's own true identity. The world is a treacherous terrain of the pursuit of material interest where patriarchal considerations reign supreme. It is also typically the domain of male. The home in its essence must remain unaffected by the profane activities of the material world, and woman is its representation. And so one gets an identification of social roles by gender to correspond with the separation of social space into ghar and bahir. The material spiritual dichotomy to which the terms world and home corresponded had acquired, as we have noted before, a very special significance in the nationalist mind. The world was where the European power had challenged the non-European peoples and by virtue of its superior material culture had subjugated them. But the nationalists asserted it had failed to colonize the inner essential identity of the East, which by its distinctive and superior spiritual culture. That is where the East was undominated, sovereign master of its own fate. The continuance of a distinct cultural problem of the minorities is an index of the failure of the Indian nation to effectively include within its body the whole of the demographic mass that it claims to represent. It is women and not just the bureaucracy and the intelligentsia who produce nations biologically, culturally, and symbolically. Why then are women usually hidden in the various theorizations of the nationalist phenomena? Women and the family are located in the private domain, which is not seen as politically relevant. Carol Petman and other feminists have challenged the validity of this model and public-private divide even within its own assumption. Women entry in the nationalist movement of India can be traced back to the civil disobedience movement. There are some autobiographies and narratives available on women leaders, mostly belonging to the elite section of the society, whereas the chunk of women who are from ordinary strata left untouched and unnoticed, but they too participated very actively. So before coronavirus pandemic obliterates our recent memory, I thought to revisit the tale, an incredible story of how a group of Muslim women with their daughters, children, and grandchildren backed together in a single act of defiance, crossing the limits of domain and setting up new limits. The tool adapted for expressing resistance were poetry, paintings, quotes from Ambedkar, Gandhi, highlighting the constitution, preamble, fundamental rights, songs, candle lightning, flashlights of mobile, all speaking of solidarity. To this sort of resistance, the ultra-national regime has no words to say, but to take recourse to oppressive measures. These women showed the real color of nationalism, which is not flamboyant and rich in Zingoism. The state initially laughed at this ignorant and illiterate women, but gradually they were raising questions like how could this woman emerge from their ingrained backwardness in their burqas and hijabs? How could this woman take the leading role in a movement? It has never happened before. No, they were not ignorant. They were rising up to tell the regime that they are tired of proving that they are as much Indian as anyone else for the last 73 years of independence. They were tired of the relentless and regular communal riot that occurred across India, where hundreds of lives were lost, community livelihood destroyed, memoirs scared for lifetime, and where no one was held responsible for these horrifying brutalities. The Shaheen women wondered what kind of azadi they have received after independence. Thus, holding up the picture of Ambedkar, the chairman of the drafting committee of constitution, they raised question about the constant violation of constitutional norms. Holding the picture of Gandhi, they sat for an indefinite satyagraha, the battle for truth. Shaheen Bagh became a beacon, a shining light, a call for people to come together before it was too late. Hindus, Christians, Sikh, Buddhists, Muslim all sang their prayers together. The protest at Shaheen Bagh went on, but it was dwindling. The effects of the COVID-19 pandemic and the need for social distancing began to take its toll. It was on March 23 that this woman and their remaining supporters headed to their home. Their movement has lasted about 100 days. The police, when clearing up the area, made sure that nothing remained that could remind people how once in this historic space people came together to celebrate democracy and reclaim their republic. It was a land of poetry. Sherry Arthur, 1974, has argued more generally that women tend to be identified with nature while men tend to be identified with culture. This is so because in bearing children, women create new things naturally.
Ms. Sudipta, I'm interrupting. Sorry for that. As we are running late, you have 2 minutes more. Right?
Actually, I have one line to complete. I have one line to complete.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
And I would request Parvati MS, the next presenter for this session, to be ready with your presentation on the paper. Okay, you go on.
Okay, Nisha, while men tend to be identified with culture, I will end my paper with a line of a song from the land itself. And the quote, "ये बात सभी को समझाए, मिलकर जालिम को टकराए, हिंदू हो या मुस्लिम हो, सबसे पहले तुम इंसान हो." Thank you. Thus, I wrapped up my paper.
So now I would request Parvati MS ma'am, and Parvati MS is a research scholar, Department of English, EFLU, Hyderabad, and the title of her paper is Gendering of Spaces, Dismantling the Public Private Binary in the Inheritance of Loss. Esra Santesso ma'am, because of the fact we are running late, that's why we are just taking the presenters. We are giving chances to the presenters for making their presentations, and after that, you just please conduct the interactive section. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. My paper is on the principle of gendering of spaces as public or private, and how those principles are applied in the novel The Inheritance of Loss by Kiran Desai. So I'll begin my paper with a quote from Doreen Massey. From the symbolic meaning of spaces or places and the clearly gendered messages which they transmit, to straightforward exclusion by violence, spaces and places are not themselves gendered, but in their being so, both reflect and affect the ways in which gender is constructed and understood. Unquote. The socio-economic restructuring of societies in the aftermath of the Second World War delegitimized the popular concepts of temporality and decoupled the notions of time and linear progress. These changes destabilized the perceptions of traditional history as a progressive movement towards enlightenment and of the concept of space as depoliticized. The displacement and transgression of the traditional notions of time, space, history, and linear progress inaugurated what Frederick Jameson calls spatial imagination, which is capable of confronting the past in a new way, in his own quotes. Marxist geographers such as David Harvey and Edward Soria conceive Jameson's spatial imagination as a dialectic between the spatial and the social. Space is structured by material realities and cultural codes, and this space is defined through power relations operating within it. Feminist geographers such as Doreen Massey, Liz Bondi, Linda McDowell, and Gillian Roos articulate space and gender relations and maintain that space structures and is structured by gender relations. This articulation of space and gender relations emphasizes the primacy of representation in the principle of gendering of spaces. According to the Marxist philosopher Henri Lefebvre, representation helps produce and is productive of social space, and this takes place through three main processes. One, spatial practice; two, representations of space; and three, representational space. The paradigm of the separate spheres, that is, dividing spaces or gendering spaces as public and private, is a pervasive representation of gendered spaces. Enlightenment philosophers like Immanuel Kant conflated this public-private binary with mind-body dualism and located reason firmly within the public sphere. The delegitimizing of the body is, according to Iris Marion Young, the philosopher, is embedded in the liberal political theory, which relies on the opposition between public and private dimensions of life. And it corresponds to an opposition between reason on the one hand and body, affectivity, and desire on the other. Kant's disembodied enlightenment individual is defined by his willingness to use reason in a public space, and this disembodied enlightenment individual is embedded in structures of masculinity rather than femininity. The materiality of women's bodies forecloses their participation in the public space as a result, and instead relegates women to the private space, which is structured by feelings rather than by the universal principle of reason and knowledge. The mind-body dualism and its accompanying public-private binary promote the exclusion of women from the public space and from domains of science and knowledge. This oppositional and hierarchical system enables the separation of the dominant public male realm of production from the subordinate female private sphere of reproduction. The ideological assumptions concerning gender, sex, and space, apropos the public-private binary, are reproduced in cultural representations of space. This paper identifies how the ideology of the separate spheres informs the portrayal of spaces in the novel The Inheritance of Laws. The Inheritance of Laws is set in 1986, where the narrative arc of the novel unravels in the household of Jemubai Patel, who's a retired judge and who's living in Kalimpong, which is a mountain village near Darjeeling in West Bengal. A former judge, he lives with his cook and his dog, and Jemubai is a recluse whose life world is limited to his bungalow and who remains physically and emotionally disconnected from the rest of his family and the society as a whole. This disconnected existence has its roots in his education in London during the 1930s, where he was interpolated into the Western discourse while he was simultaneously at the receiving end of racism stemming from this very Western discourse. And thereby he lives with a perpetual sense of a fragmented identity, that he is part Western and he is part native, or quote unquote. This fragmented identity condemns him to a life of perpetual disconnect and placelessness. To quote Kiran Desai, the solitude became a habit. The habit became the man, and it crushed him into a shadow. Unquote. The arrival of Jemubai's granddaughter Sai in the bungalow does not deter him from this sense of placelessness. Until her arrival in the bungalow, she was positioned under the impersonal and disciplining vision, that is, vision as in the sense of gaze, of the nuns in her convent school, which militated against her sense of privacy and place. However, her life away from the nuns' security paranoid gaze did not facilitate her sense of belonging in the bungalow in Kalimpong, which, in the words of Kiran Desai, quote, every now and then she looked up at Kanchenjunga, observed its wizard phosphorescence with a shiver. The judge sat at the far corner with his chessboard, playing against himself. Stuffed under his chair where she felt safe was Mutt, the dog, snoring gently in her sleep. A single boiled light bulb dangled on a wire above. It was cold, but inside the house it was still colder. The dark, the freeze, contained by stone walls several feet. Unquote. As Sai gradually falls for her tutor Gyan, she develops a sense of security for the first time after coming to Kalimpong, or maybe in her life in general. She develops a sense of security within the walls of the bungalow in his presence. Again, to quote Kiran Desai, when they would finally attempt to rise from those indolent afternoons they spent together, Gyan and Sai would have melted into each other like pats of butter. How difficult it was to cool and compose themselves back into their individual beings. Unquote. This sense of belonging and security is violently interrupted when Gyan starts to get involved in the insurgent movement for Gorkhaland, which stemmed up in Darjeeling during the 1980s. Fearing the sudden erosion of her place, that is, place as in her place of security and belonging, in the presence of Gyan. So Gyan's absence triggered, triggered Sai, and she tries to confront him, only to only to be physically assaulted by Gyan. This episode of physical assault deepens Sai's feeling of vulnerability and forecloses the possibilities of finding a home in the house of Jemubhai Patel. Again, to quote Kiran Desai, the simplicity of what she had been told wouldn't hold. Never again could she think there was but one narrative, and that this narrative belonged only to herself, that she might create her own tiny happiness and live safely with it. Unquote. The bungalow does not translate as a safe refuge for Jemubhai either. It shields him from the outer world without offering him a sense of place. The boundary between the outer world and his house is constantly breached by outside threats, which is exemplified by the Gorkhaland insurgents barging into his house and harassing him and his servant and murdering his dog Mutt. This Kiran Desai dismantles the ideology of domesticity, which glorifies home as a place of security, belonging, and a sense of safety. This ideology of domesticity underlying the public-private divide is dismantled by Kiran Desai by constructing the household of Jemubhai as a place which is constantly under threat by Gorkhaland insurgents and constantly under threat by Gyan, who turns into a figure of threat. Threat when Gyan beats up Sai. So, to conclude, the structuring principles of femininity and masculinity are determined by enlightenment principles which privileged reason or mind over corporeality or body. This mind-body dualism conflicts with the ideology of the public-private divide, which further regulated the significations of masculinity and femininity. The private space was fashioned as a feminine realm, though it was not relegated exclusively to women. Though the public and private spaces were gendered as male and female, which, however, limited women's access to the public, the house or the private spaces were still realms where men could easily come and go. So it is not a place where women are enabled a sense of security because there is constantly this threat from the outside, which, as in the novel, is exemplified by threats from the Gorkhaland insurgents. The private space was fashioned as a feminine realm, though it was not relegated exclusively to women. The spatial practices of masculinity have accorded greater mobility to men, which enabled men to move freely between the separate spheres. The public sphere was the space of activity and freedom, whereas the private sphere was designated for men as a place of refuge from the hullabaloo of professional life. The cultural artifacts are imbricated in this public-private ideology, which regulated men's and women's behavior in the respective public and private realms. The novel The Inheritance of Laws responds to this hegemony of domesticity by dismantling the representation of home as a place of refuge from the outside world. Except for the duration of Sai's romance with Gyan, Sai leads a life of perpetual detachment and placelessness, though she is located for most part within Jemubhai's household, which is a private space. The violent and constant intrusion of insurgents into this household militates against the construction of home as a safe refuge. This dismantling of the public-private divide and of the significations that this divide holds and which bestows on the public and private spheres proposes possibilities of resistance to gendered hierarchies of spatialization, and promotes a critical purview on in-between spaces, which resists the separation of spaces into clear-cut divisions of the public or the private. Thank you.
I thank both the presenters, Sudipta Banerjee and Parvati MS, for their nice presentations. And now I would request Professor Esra Mirze Santesso ma'am to conduct this interactive session. Ma'am, it's over to you.
Thank you so much to both of our presenters. So I take it we don't have a third presenter then?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So I'm going to start with Sudipta, and I have to say I have a colleague here at the University of Georgia from New Delhi, and his name is Aruni Kashyap. He's a creative writer, a wonderful writer, and he has been educating me about what has been going on in Shaheen Bagh, and very interesting to follow that kind of a different sense of community that is being organized over there as a form of resistance. But I'm really interested in the way, Sudipta, that you were talking about nationalism and kind of bringing this history of elitism that has really gone into the nation building process, not only including the colonial elitism, but also British elitism, and that which comes with that kind of the imperial, patriotic, almost chauvinistic forms of nation building as well, and how you complicated that with the idea of heterogeneity, diversity, and inclusion and belonging, how those kinds of questions are no longer flattened by the kind of ethnic purity, racial purity, or even linguistic purity that we once assumed to be a part of the definition of the nation. And of course, the way you complicated that with gender is admirable, especially because not many people talking about the nation like Ernest Renan, Benedict Anderson really foreground gender. Even when we go to post-colonial theorists, you quoted from Frantz Fanon, even to think back on MS Cesar, there's very little discussion on gender. But what struck me is the way you talked about identity and the performance of the women taking part in these protests. So because we always talk about identity in a very pedagogical sense, right? There are different kinds of identities. But what you focused on was the performative side of identity that included body language and vocal tones. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about how performance complicates our understanding of manifesting identity, but also political agency, and also act as a foundation for political resistance.
I can say that actually in Bengali we have a very colloquial saying, okay, and the saying is, if you are speaking lie also, and if you speak it with a total 100% confidence, people will take it to be true. Okay, that's okay, that's the thing, and that's a very common thing, colloquial thing that actually goes with the Bengali when we are accustomed with the club culture. So it happens, huh? So why I actually, I always, whenever I have been a part of many sort of social movement in my area, as I have been a little bit of political movements also. So I know that when a woman takes part in a political movement, what she needs at very utmost basis or in the very primary basis is the body language, is the confidence. Because what happens is that when a woman actually get out of the inner domain and face the world, and that to be the political issues, the thing is like, how do you know? You are busy in cooking, you are busy in rearing children, you are busy in looking after your husband, you are busy in looking after your father. How do you know? That's the thing that you actually face. And when these women also get out of the domain, of the very inner domain, and they face the world with CAA, NRC, and NPR, then definitely the government at the very beginning and the supporters of the right wing, basically, they laughed at them. And that's the very truth, actually. They laughed at them. And this woman actually proved, they gradually proved through their performance only that no, we are not ignorant, illiterate mass. We know about everything. It's different thing that we are actually, as you were quoting Gayatri Chakraborty's Vivek, can the subaltern speak? In the very opening session, I was actually hearing that thing. And that way, that women are not allowed to speak. Now we don't have our own language. Always we're taking the language of this man or that man or someone other. But when the woman is actually speaking in his own language, is actually giving a very confidential body language and challenging the patriarchy see like, okay, fine. That's a sort of resistance. They go for they at least take 2 steps backward. That's why I focused on the body language and the focal tone of women that has been adopted as a tool of resistance by this woman.
I am so stealing that the way that you presented how the saying, the colloquial saying about speaking with 100% certainty so that it is taken as truth by others.
No, actually it happens. You even ask other who are part of this platform. This is true. I am not saying of my mind. That's what I have always heard also. এটাকে বেঙ্গলিতে বলে তুমি যদি মিথ্যে কথাটাকে ভীষণ কনফিডেন্টলি বলো, মানুষ তোমার মিথ্যে কথাটাকেও সত্যি হিসেবে নেবে। that's what it is.
I have one more quick question for you before I move on to Parvati. But I was thinking about the way you, again, problematize nation and what kinds of difficulties and challenges await for any kind of a citizen belonging to specific nations. But if we consider especially what happened throughout history, which started with community living from tribalism to feudalism to colonialism to nationalism. And there was a very brief period, I think in early 2000s maybe, where we started thinking about post-nationalism, right? Look at what's happening in EU, look at what's happening with all these transnational structures like the United Nations or IMF. But at the same time, they have very different kinds of hegemonies that they exert. So I wonder if perhaps if you could speak about how you see this either movement from nationalism to post-nationalism, perhaps as a utopia, or maybe the movement from nationalism to post-nationalism as an impossibility, since, again, there's that kind of recovering of purity and xenophobia that has been happening with many of the nation states in the global sphere.
I find, I would like to say that impossible is a word found in the dictionary of fools. Nothing is impossible. What I always believe, if you want to exist, you need to resist. And resistance is very important for your existence. So if you're finding means, I think that, I don't know that you were aware or not, but just 2 days back, I'm talking about it in Facebook, also in my social media platform. And today I was, in the morning, I was attending another national conference there. Also, I said the same thing. A Tanishq ad. Tanishq is a showroom. I think I don't know that whether you know about this Tanishq jewelry, and they have actually focused an ad just 2 days back. It was banned on India. It was banned because they're a Hindu daughter-in-law who is a part of the Muslim family. That daughter-in-law, the mother-in-law, that is the Muslim mother-in-law, is performing the baby shower. That in Bengali, যেটাকে আমরা সাত বলি, and in Hindi it's called God Bharai. So that baby shower ritual was going on, and I don't know what was there, but people of the majoritarian sector, I found in Facebook was flooded with the messages that it was that the ad is bearing fake secularism and the ad is bearing love jihadic elements. Okay. So I posted that I didn't find any sort of love jihadic elements on the ad, because it's something, the motto of the entire advertisement, Tanishq has actually put forward after that a disclaimer, and they have said that this is something that we wanted to do, that in this coronavirus pandemic time, we're actually celebrating coming together and celebrating the festivals, as Durga Puja is ahead, Diwali is ahead, Navaratri is also coming. So all sort of this thing. So yes, nothing is impossible, because we are in a situation, I sometimes feel like I am living in 21st century when my country is claiming for digital India. I am communicating with you through digital platform, and my country is actually fighting only on Hindu and Muslim basis, and not only Hindu Muslim basis, Dalit and tribals, and everyone is fighting on the religious basis. And India has a lot more issues to focus, but we only focus on this sort of secularistic things, and we goes on fighting. I don't know what ultimate that achieve. And the most people who are actually indulged in this sort of fighting, they don't know the entire story. They only take 2% or 3% of the story, and they fabricate their own narrative, and then they spread out. And that's the ultimate problem. So I don't think that the movement from nationalism to post-nationalism will be a total utopia. I don't consider. I feel like sometimes maybe when I will be a grandmother, my grandchildren will definitely be seeing this movement to be a real thing, because I really dream that my generation coming after, the generations who are coming after me should see the world in the new form, in the form that actually Tagore dreamt of, the form that we are reading, that the form I want to see, whatever we are reading, I want to see it in a practical form. So I don't want to consider it as utopia, because if I do so, then my entire sort of doing these works will ultimately become meaningless. So I don't want to view it as a utopia.
Wow, your optimism is infectious. Thank you so much for your answers.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a great part to hear you.
Parvati, thank you so much for your presentation as well. I really enjoyed the way you talked about the separate spheres, the public and the private. Of course, the private being associated with the idea of domesticity and female space, as opposed to the public, which is more interactive and collective, and of course masculine. And I really like the way you used Kiran Desai's book as a way to kind of challenge those, challenge that binary. But I'm interested in perhaps if you could expand a little bit more on the role that politics play, because again, we always tend to think that politics belong to the public space, and we very rarely think about politics as a part of the domestic space, which you very eloquently mentioned is what's going on in the inheritance of loss. But how does that, the entry or the rethinking of the domestic space as politics change the way we think about political agency and especially female participation?
That question is very relevant, ma'am, because I come from this state called Kerala, which is one of the states with the highest education, especially among women in the whole country. So in a society like that, we consider that women are endowed with higher political agency and that they have a higher political participation. But the case is almost the opposite, because though women have, because the education rates are almost 100%, and that is like almost wholly literate, there is like the participation in higher education among men and women is like really high compared to the rest of the country, but still higher education is considered as more of a finishing school kind of a setup, especially for women. So it has turned into a requirement where women are eligible for marriage. That is, a certain level of education increases their marriageability. There are the number of homemakers who are really educated, like the graduate or a postgraduate degree is really high in India. So these aspects like education or higher literacy rates, which are supposed to be bestowing women with higher political agency, is actually doing, paradoxically, it has somewhat of a kind of a reverse effect in Kerala. So education has lost that kind of political agency in this place, at least from in the society where I come from. And women, the political participation, that is the personalist political motto, is completely lost in the state. So women, if they try to venture outside of domestic spaces, are met with huge resistance. So if a woman is supposed to study outside her hometown, or that is to travel to a university which is farther away from home, or participate in political rallies, it is considered as almost taboo, though it is supposed to be more educated compared to the rest of the state. So personally, I find this public-private divide as having its is really having its stronghold still in the society where I come from. So women are educated and women are given entry into the public sphere. It is dictated by I don't want to call it patriarchy because it might seem like a cliche, but still it is dictated by patriarchal structures. So the public participation of women is still dictated by patriarchal structures, which decide that how much of education is a woman supposed to have. And they still consider that domestic sphere is supposed to be where a woman is supposed to be. So like my co-presenter talked about Facebook and the virtual spaces, women voicing their opinions in the virtual spaces itself considered a taboo. So they are consistently subjected to trolling and other such vitriolic abuse in the digital space, let alone in the real spaces. So even in political rallies or in political parties as such, we find women's participation to be abysmally low when compared to their participation in education. So I find that politics to be still prevalent in the society where I come from. That this public-private binary and its ideology is still having its stronghold in my society.
And also its pedagogical value in a way to raise the next generations.
Yes.
But Debolina, do we have time for one more question, or are we
Ma'am, we are already running late.
running
so
late? Okay.
It's, yeah. Thank you so very much for, I thank from the core of my heart and from the, on behalf of the department, I thank both the presenters for making such wonderful presentations and for sharing your wonderful views with us. I thank Professor Esra Mirze Santesso ma'am for giving us time from your busy schedule and for making this session absolutely a unique one and sharing your innovative ideas. And you can see that how you have lit up candles from as we were having the interactive sessions. So many questions, observations. So we are completely the end of this particular session, but we really do not want to, we are not in an intention to leave you. I would like to, and it is a saying that a journey should end with the very wish to meet again. So we again want to meet you. On behalf of the department, on behalf of the college, once again, I am inviting you to visit this place and meet us. And you really, with your smile and with your very interactive sessions and your the way you are presenting your papers, I was really feeling that I'm in a class, right? It was so very, organized way of presentation. And I would like to end this session, conclude this session, quoting Agha Sahid Ali's poem called The Pastoral. I would like to quote a few lines. We shall meet again in Srinagar by the gates of Villa of Peace. Our hands blossoming into face, till the soldiers return the keys and disappear. Again we will enter a last world, the first that vanished. So after this pandemic situation, after this COVID-19 gets vanished, we will again meet somewhere in academic, where in this fruitful academic platform where we can have this kind of academic interactions once again. So that's all from my part for today, ma'am.
I just want to say, Debolina, what a lovely way to end the session. And thank you so much for your kind invitation. And instead of saying goodbye, then I will say, may we meet again.
Yeah.
And soon.
Thank you. Yeah, and soon. Thank you.
Thank you.